We were on screen a little while ago, which I think was West Highland College. Well, hopefully they'll join us again. Can I just ask you, as you were doing, if you can keep your mics on mute when you're not speaking. We'll come back and we'll make sure that you have the opportunity to ask questions as well as people in the room. Just be forewarned that we can see you at all times. We've got dual screens, so you are on screen. Okay. I could also say, both for people on VC and in the audience, just to let you know that this is being video recorded so that we can make use of this more widely after the event, both to the public and to our own students and staff. Professor Jane Downs is an eminent archaeologist, I think it would be fair to say, and she's worked at a number of universities. She initially studied herself the BA Honours in Ancient History and Archaeology at Manchester University. And she then worked for several years at the Fenland Archaeological Trust on prehistoric sites at Eton and Flag Fen. And she then moved on to work at Glasgow University as a research assistant and then a project officer and project manager for GARD. And then she then transferred to Sheffield University in 1995 and took the post of assistant director of Arcus. It's nice to know that UHI isn't the only place that uses acronyms for things that it does, and we're coming to another one in a minute. In both of those posts, she worked on Orkney, and we were very, very pleased when in 1991, beyond just simply working there, Jane took up a post as a lecturer at Orkney College, UHI, where she set up her own MA and postgraduate diploma courses in archaeological practice. Her own PhD was in Bronze Age cremation practices in Orkney, and that was awarded from Sheffield University earlier in her career. On a personal basis, Jane's research interests focus on burial archaeology, particularly cremation, and in prehistoric and landscape archaeology. And she also has, and this will be obviously relevant given the title of tonight's talk, research interests in the management and sustainable development of landscape and cultural heritage resources. And that's led to her having an active involvement and engagement with research at several World Heritage Sites, including Rapa Nui, Easter Island. In fact, if I had one negative thing to say about Jane, it's sometimes when we need to speak to her at critical points in the year about research or curriculum matters, we can't get hold of her because she's in these far-flung places doing interesting archaeological things. But on Orkney, she has been involved, currently is involved with Mine Howe, with work at Orkney Barrows, with the Nouns of Trotty, and at the Ring of Brodgar. And at Mine Howe, she's co-director for the Orca project. I said there would be yet another acronym that would come and hit us in due course. Internally, she's the head of Orkney College's archaeology department, as well as director of the Orca setup. She's also a member of the UHI Academic Council. She sits on our research committee, and she's an active member of our Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences faculty board. She is very much one of our leading academic staff, and I'm very pleased that that's been recognised with professorial title. But she also plays a very, very active role, not just in her own field of research, but in the academic community and ongoing development of UHI. We hope that by the end of this calendar year, UHI will have submitted an application for research degree awarding powers, which is the missing piece in the jigsaw in the university's maturation to full status. And submitting for research degree awarding powers means submitting a profile not just of the staff that we have, but also a picture of how we're developing our research strength, our research presence and portfolio moving forward, and how our existing research community is supporting and nurturing young researchers coming forward. And Jane, a very, very key part of that message and that story when we submit a picture of the research strength within the institution. I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to hand over to Jane and welcome, and we very much look forward to your talk. At the end, there'll be time for questions from the audience. But Jane, over to you now. We're going to move to a PowerPoint presentation, which if you're having trouble seeing that on VC, please do open your mic and let us know. Okay, but your screen should now switch to the PowerPoint.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to be invited to give my inaugural lecture and to speak about some of the things which I find most interesting with you tonight. I hope you find the lecture interesting. I'm going to tackle a great big and possibly seen as thorny topic, and that's archaeology and sustainability. And I'm actually looking specifically at what we can say about the archaeology of sustainability. So in the lecture, I will be looking at the relationship between archaeology and the paleo-environmental studies. I'll be looking at how we've perceived environmental change and the traditional views that we've had of that in the past. And then I'll be moving on to looking at how I think we should look at how people sustained themselves in the past in terms of bringing together different approaches, melding more social and interpretive approaches of archaeology together with environmental sciences. I shall be using several examples, mostly of research that I'm connected with, to talk about this aspect. And then I shall conclude with looking at what I think archaeology can contribute to sustainability studies and sustainability debate as a whole.
Switch.
Yeah. So, in giving the lecture tonight, I will be sort of as much showing where I've come from and how I've come to the point I am at the moment in terms of my research. So, the research I've undertaken throughout my career as an archaeologist has involved working in some, I suppose you'd say, challenging, if not hostile, environments, and ones that were quite challenging and quite dynamic in the past, including spending quite a long time at Flag Fen, looking at the Bronze Age site there, which is right on the fen edge of not at Peterborough itself. So it's a site that is a preserved wooden trackway leading out from the fen edge into the watery areas, and excavating there was quite a challenge at times, apart from being situated right near the big sewage plant and several factories. Anyway, upland landscapes as well. I've excavated on quite a few of those, quite a few exposed places. And also a lot of my work has focused on coastally eroding sites, of which I will refer to. The problem of coastal erosion, of course, in the Northern Isles and Western Isles particularly, is quite acute. We have such rich archaeological resources, and quite a lot of them are being eroded into the sea through the results of increased sea levels and increased storminess. So that problem is only going to get worse. So I'll be bringing in some aspects of those, but I won't actually be focusing today on so much the sort of current aspects of sustainability in terms of resource management and sustainable development. I'll be focusing instead on how we look at sustainability in the past. Another project that I'm involved with now with Colin Richards, who's here in the audience, and also which is led by Sue Hamilton of UCL, is an AHRC funded project in Rapa Nui or Easter Island. And I bring this project in at this point because we can't have a discussion, or we can't talk about sustainability in archaeology without, of course, bringing in Easter Island and the famous story of ecocide, or this perception that this island community just flagrantly used up their resources, which led to the collapse of their society. The research that we're focusing on is looking at landscape as a whole, in particular how these ahu, the platforms, came to be constructed and the statues that sit upon them. Note the top knot on top of one of the statues. We're examining the quarry where those top knots were quarried from. So, kind of, I suppose, what I call the myth of Easter Island. I'll summarise it briefly. It was sort of, I suppose, called into being by John Flenley and Paul Barn. Flenley's work on looking at the pollen from cores taken within some of the crater deposits, showing that the trees on Easter Island, particularly the big palms, were all died off at a particular point in time. So extrapolating from that, they created the story that this was the Easter Island people destroying their own environment and leaving themselves therefore unable to go to sea anymore, and the canoes because they couldn't build canoes anymore, etc., etc. Programs of research subsequent to this analysis, particularly by archaeologists but also by other disciplines such as ethnographers, have shown this to be deeply flawed, if not completely wrong, because for a start, the chronologies aren't secure enough to say when these events happened, but it's likely that the degradation of the soil and the tree loss was even started before the island was settled. Then there's the factor of bringing in the Polynesian rats, which ate the palm nuts, and the extent to which that caused the loss of the trees, but they certainly contributed to the loss of the trees. But to say that that then had the consequences of creating a treeless desert which was stalked by famine, violence and possibly cannibalism, I think is taking the whole thing to extremes that it should never have been taken to. And this is, of course, Flenley and Barnes' take on things, which was then further elaborated upon by Jared Diamond in his book Collapse. So this tale about Easter Island as a parable or as a story, as a lesson for us in how to look after our environment, has been in the public domain for about over 20 years now. And it is the aspect of Easter Island that has lodged in everybody's head, in the public imagination, the public consciousness. And I think it's well past time that it was actually overturned, because it's really quite an insult to the evidence. But even though it's still taught widely to undergraduates as a lesson in how we should be more conscious of the environment, I don't think in the 20 years that this story has been told that it's actually had a particularly beneficial impact. And I think it's because it treats the people on Easter Island as completely passive and ignorant, and is a completely negative picture of what could happen with the society. And I'll be taking issue with some of these aspects as I talk through the examples when I move to looking more at the evidence in Scotland. As I say, it's very complex, the picture of what actually did happen on Easter Island, and we could certainly do with a lot more radiocarbon dating to see the whole sequence of events, or when the island was settled, and then what the various stages activity where. But we know for sure that they had a very sophisticated agricultural system, despite the lack of trees, and this was the use of manavai and stone mulching. And you can see here in the slide we've got a manavai. In Scotland we'd call them planticrues, stone walling built round plants to protect them from the elements and also to keep the water in. And then the stone mulching, you can see the stones behind the manavai, where they're actually spreading stones across the fields to protect the soil and keep moisture in. So they had a very sophisticated technique of making the most of the landscape within which they were living. And in fact, quite a lot of the soil erosion or the soil degradation relates to more modern times. And that's something that we're seeing through our excavation at Poonapau, which is the quarry where the hats were quarried from. And looking at this picture, I hope you can see there's a sort of fence around with some people, and that's our excavation trench within the crater, where we're excavating at the face of the quarry to look at quarrying activities in more detail. When we were excavating down through the material that had accumulated, we found that there had been a huge build-up since the time that the Easter Island was largely turned over to sheep farming. It had its own clearances in the 19th century, which were implemented by a Scottish factor. So more or less the whole of the island was turned over to sheep farming, and the result was there was a huge amount of soil movement and soil degradation because of that. Likewise, or most markedly, I should say that attention should be paid to the impacts of contact with Europeans on Easter Island, on the belief systems, on religious activities, which were so much a part of life, that they would have had a massive impact on everything that happened after first contact. So here we see images of the first recorded contact, which was in 1722, and the contrast between that and Cook's visit in 1774. And in what was little more than 50 years, you see there's sort of aspects of sort of decay and things collapsing in inverted commas between those two visits. So really rapid change occurred when first recorded contact was made, in terms of presumably people's whole values changing with introduction to different ways of being, and probably a consequent change in religious practices, which is probably what most of the accounts are about. And indeed, we don't even know whether this was the first contact or whether there had been contact before. So there was a longer period of changes occurring. So that's just all to try and put the idea of Easter Island and its ecocide in some context, and to take issue with it, which I do quite strongly. To move swiftly to Scotland, and you can see that hopefully that's not completely unconnected, in that we're looking at upland landscapes and clearance landscapes in Scotland too. It's not only for Easter Island that this sort of idea of ecocide, or people not being able to manage their own environments, is promulgated. I suppose it's the Bronze Age period in Britain and in Scotland which has been mostly the victim of this kind of discussion of people who, there was population pressure in the lowlands, so they expanded their farming practices up into the highlands. They destabilized the soil. There was increasing wetness in terms of climate change, and the whole thing got covered in peat, and then the people had to abandon their settlements. So this is the kind of story that Burgess was telling from the 70s right into the 90s, Colin Burgess, about upland settlement in northern Britain and into Scotland. So the Bronze Age has been the focus of a lot of investigation and research into the relationship between climate change or environmental change and social change. This has been hampered because the evidence from, well, the environmental evidence, the paleoenvironmental evidence, hasn't been particularly robust in terms of when Burgess started talking about these theories. So he was using the settlement evidence to make these theories. Since then, there's a lot more environmental evidence and a lot more settlements have been excavated. So we're getting a much more complex and interesting picture about people not abandoning sites completely, coming back to them, and also perhaps some of the sites being shieling and different uses of the landscape as early as the Bronze Age, which is happening in other places as well in later prehistory in Scandinavia. So I think we are getting a more nuanced picture perhaps of the Bronze Age. And certainly in terms of our evidence for environmental change or climate change, there has been a lot of research, and it's been pulled together firstly for the SCARF, or Scottish Archaeological Research Framework documents, which are all on the web and you can look at. Richard Tipping has pulled together a lot of material. And then in a recent paper, which has been produced by these authors, where, as they say here, they think that Scotland is exceptionally well placed to explore the relationship between people and climate change in prehistory, which I think it is. And in their article, they kind of what they call a research agenda, pleading for environmental archaeologists or paleoenvironmentalists and archaeologists to communicate more and work together so that we can look at the relationship between environmental change and social change or cultural change in a more informed way, because to date these things have really been done to the exclusion of one another. So you get this idea that people who look at environmental archaeology or who look at the paleo-environment are very kind of deterministic in the way they perceive of society and its responses or reactions to climate change. And then the more social archaeology has not really engaged with this and looked at the finer detail of cultural change or social change and its relationship to environmental change. So that's what I want to do here tonight, is to find some ways of looking at these relationships in more detail and proposing how we could go about doing this better than we do now, because really I think that in terms of a contribution to looking at sustainability in the past and environmental change and its relation to cultural change in the past, archaeology hasn't really stepped up to the mark yet. So that makes it an exciting time. I think there's lots of potential for it, but it's yet to happen. So we have lots of, increasing amounts of evidence for climate and environmental change. We know, for example, in sort of periods of some hundreds of years, that, for example, the period 2500 to 2200 BC was wetter than average, and then continued to be wet from 2000 to 1500 BC. Temperatures in Scotland around 2000 BC were 1 degree warmer in summer and 1 degree colder in winter. And then something that I'm going to talk more about, we have evidence of dune construction on a large scale. That is peaks in sand transport at 2200 to 2100 BC, and that can be seen in southern Sweden, and that's something that we can pick up also in the evidence from Orkney. So there are some of these climate change, well, some evidence for climate change which has been drawn into Scotland from elsewhere, and some which can be picked up at a local level. And this is because we're kind of working with records that haven't really been, information that hasn't been gained particularly strategically. It's just working with what's there, really. So I think a more strategic approach needs to be taken to looking at change on a kind of landscape level or a local level. So in order to consider how cultural change might relate to environmental change, or in order to ask the question, how did people perceive environmental change and climate change, or did they perceive it? Was it on sort of time scale that was over several generations, which is what some of this data seems to suggest, that people wouldn't actually be perceiving that it was getting increasingly wet or increasingly cold, or were there events that they could actually see happening within their lifetimes? So we can only consider these aspects of people's relationship with the climate when we think more about their relationship with the environment, and that is with their world as a whole. So I would contend that we can't think about how people were responding to or adapting to climate change at all unless we think about how they conceived of their world. When we're thinking about prehistoric worlds, we're thinking about a different world. The past is a different place. We have to accept and understand that people would have a cosmogony, they would have a story for how their world came into being, and a cosmology, a belief system that they would live within, and an ontology, an understanding of their place in the world. We know from pretty much every site we excavate, and I'm going to be showing some examples, that there was ritual activity in every aspect of their life. We see deposits, we see the cosmological understanding of the world expressed in their architecture. We see them operating probably within a highly ritualized society, if you like. Along with these belief systems, and I think something that's very relevant when we're thinking about change and strategies to combat change, or to preempt change and to live within the world, are aspects such as contingency, risk, and ritual efficacy, and I'll be coming back to those as we go along. It's also apparent, and this is through lots of different approaches and lots of different aspects of social theory and interpretative archaeology, that people had particularly strong relationships with the environment, in that they probably didn't disassociate themselves from their environment. There was an inalienability about their relationship, probably with materials, animals, as well as other humans. And those links would be seen to be indissoluble. So it's not that people couldn't separate themselves from these things, but it leaves aspects like even things like materials could be animate. So you have this idea of a living world where everything can have agency and can have a life of its own. And that would apply to the elements as well. and natural phenomena such as storm events, rainbows, the northern lights. You know, all the aspects of the cosmos would have to be explained in some way and incorporated into an understanding of the world. And this is where we have this idea of supernaturalism, where people relate socially and have an understanding of environmental phenomena and incorporate that into their belief systems and understandings of the world. To talk about ritual, or just to stress the importance of ritual, because I know that to some people have an aversion to the idea of it when they like to think about more prosaic activities in terms of the archaeological record. I just moved to a site called Howe in Orkney, which myself and Nick Card are bringing to publication at the moment. So it's kind of in my mind at the moment, where I'm doing some more research and finding out some more things about it. But I just thought I'd use as an example a site which seems to have no other purpose than to fulfill ritual or religious functions and activities. And it's an Iron Age subterranean structure which has 29 steps going into a natural mound. So we have this incredibly elaborate structure built within a mound, which goes down, the steps go down to a cistern or chamber at the bottom. This site, so the entrance to the chamber, or the underground, the subterranean element, is within that little box. If you can see that on top of the mound there, that's what the farmer put there so that people could get in and out of it. You can, when you made it into a visitor attraction. So that's how it relates to the mound itself. There we are. That's the entrance into the mound and down into the steps. And then this whole mound is surrounded by an enormous ditch. And out with the ditch are really, really well-preserved remains of metalworking buildings. And then the ditch is infilled, all that huge area of ditch is infilled with masses and masses and masses of deposits of the remains of feasting and, in brackets, high status finds. So this is a site which has a special status for from the Middle Iron Age right through even to Viking and medieval, in terms of, we found a Viking cremation near the entrance to the chamber. So it has a significance for a long period of time. And it would appear to be the focus of activities perhaps as in terms of inauguration, because there's a footprint stone from this site, a place where people could commune with the underworld or with other worlds by going into the chamber, and a place where people gathered to feast, because the debris that we're seeing in the ditch is the debris of feasting. There's huge amounts of pottery and animal bone from feasting, and this site isn't near to it isn't part of a broch, or it isn't near to a settlement site that we found yet. So people are perhaps gathering at this place from far and wide to perform ceremonies and feasting. All kinds of interesting deposits were made in the metalworking building. There was a burial of a young woman. You can see she had toe rings around her toes there. It's shown here. And a really unique object on her chest, which is perhaps to do with the metalworking process. The location of metalworking at this site indicates probably that there were appropriate places to undertake metalworking which were outside of the norm, outside of the normal settlement areas. And another burial in just in the midden outside the ditch was an adult male who had been overkilled. He'd been killed in many ways, stabbed in the back, slashed on the front, so we could see from the remains of the bones that he had lots and lots of injuries, more than were needed to kill him, and then he was just dumped in a pit that probably wasn't dug as a grave because he didn't quite fit in it. So we have the human remains deposited here, and we also have all kinds of really rare objects that you can see on the screen there. So some of these are Roman objects, and so in the kinds of materials that we're finding here, it's quite similar to High Pasture Cave on Skye, which is another site which is a natural cave but has steps down into it and has very many similar kinds of deposits at it. So this is showing that for quite a long period during the Iron Age, these two particular sites and other sites such as cave sites were used for solely for purposes such as deposition and feasting and ceremonies and these kind of activities. So this is just to show you this kind of overtly ritual site. So just to return to the Bronze Age again and back to Flag Fen, and to return to that kind of aspect of deposition, or to continue that aspect of deposition, here we have at Flag Fen something which was interpreted in the first place as perhaps a settlement built out into the water, but which is an elaborate wooden track from which hundreds and hundreds of pieces of metalwork were deposited into the wet, peaty material underneath. So this was kind of a focus for votive deposits. The Fen Edge was a very dynamic and changing environment. It was an important place for people to go out to take animals at particular times of year. So it was part of the inhabited landscape. Perhaps inundation, increased wetness and rising water was the reason why they were depositing materials here, perhaps as a strategy to help prevent the changes to the environment that they were perceiving. And this is a feature of the Bronze Age, really, that as the Bronze Age progresses, there are more and more bronze weapons and tools deposited in all kinds of contexts right through Britain, quite often at the edge of wet places or in wet places. And this is just an example of one, a find of a bronze axe at Hobbister in Orkney, which is where they were cutting peats for Highland Park whisky, which is their peat cutting area is Hobbister, and came across this bronze axe. There aren't many axes in Orkney. And we had some pollen analysis done and had a small investigation of the area, and it turned out that this is a small spring that this axe was deposited by. So right across the landscape, really, we're seeing special deposits which relate to specific parts of the landscape and could relate to different aspects or different strategies of what people were doing to ensure, continued fertility through trying to stem the tide, say, of sea level and water rising and increased wetness that they were experiencing at the time. This ties into the kind of Bronze Age cosmology or the Bronze Age world that's been expressed in this illustration by Christensen and Larson, where and this is quite well accepted, and Richard Bradley's written about this as well, and other people, that the Bronze Age world or cosmology was ranked in terms of a higher area where perhaps the gods and ancestors dwelt, associated with the sun and with burial mounds which are built up and quite often built on hilltops or higher places. And then a middle realm where the people, the everyday people live, where the agricultural activities take place and dwellings are located. And then the underworld where bronze artifacts are deposited. So you have this kind of ranking to the world where it's appropriate to put gifts to the gods, perhaps, in the wet places. And we see this this kind of understanding of the world reflected in lots of different monuments and the way the landscape is arranged or laid out in the Bronze Age right across Scotland. And this is just one example of a Bronze Age burial mound at the Trotti in Orkney, where there's very rich finds of gold and amber placed within a burial mound. And you can see just how prominent that barrow or burial mound is in the landscape. To move now to environmental changes or climate change, induced environmental change, that perhaps were things that were perceptible to people, or that they were actually engaging with as episodic events. The excavation that Colin Richards and I undertook at the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney was an investigation of the ditch around the stone circle, and we dug trenches through the ditch to establish a dating for the monument, which hadn't been dated before. And here's Colin puzzling over the section through the ditch there. So we sectioned through the ditch in two places, and in the sampling that we undertook through the sediments within the ditch, that David Sanderson undertook from Cirque in East Kilbride, it was observable that there was a particularly noticeable sandblow horizon, which was dated to about 2100 BC, found in the ditch fill. Now this accords with evidence for sandblow on the islands of Edy and Sandy, some of the outer islands on Orkney, as well as in other places on mainland Orkney. So this is clear evidence that at this particular time, there was increased storminess to the extent that sand was blown in right across the inland on the islands of Edy and Sandy. It was blown right up onto the hill, right away inland, which must have had quite an impact. And this ties in with that episode I was talking about, discernible in Sweden, where they were also observing these big sand blows. So it indicates that this particular time there were a lot of storms which were bringing sand on land, which would have had an impact on people's cultivable land. So in terms of them farming the fields, if they're covered in sand, there's evidence from Toft's Ness on Sandy that they then move away from that for a while and then come back to it, and in other places that they're actually just ploughing the sand in and continuing with their agriculture. So this is something that can also be seen to happen where people have their settlements. So we can see that in the house structures at some sites, they're actually abandoning the houses or remodelling them after sand blows. So these are things that they must have encountered periodically, and which would have had a really big impact on their lives, because they could have woken up covered in sand. So it's not that kind of imperceptible, the climate getting slightly cooler, and how did people perceive that. It's actually things which were really, really noticeable and abrupt events. So in terms of being able to see sort of horizons or points where there have been events that we think, you know, people would have really had to adapt to, how is that reflected in cultural change, or how we see changes in material culture or architecture? Well, that period of 2100 BC or thereabouts is just the very, very end of the Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age in Orkney anyway, where it's seen. And it's around 2000 BC that we actually see pretty fundamental changes in almost every respect in terms of house architecture changes. These tools of cultivation, stone tools, are introduced in terms of ards and mattocks. And these are very widespread right across Shetland and Orkney. And there are really marked changes in burial practices too. So the relationship, of course, between these very stormy events and things that were happening to the land and all the changes that are happening in architecture and material culture, you know, we can't say for sure how they were related, but we can see that things changed significantly after this particularly stormy period. And so this might be one particular instance where we're getting a glimpse of climate and environmental change and cultural change being quite close together in terms of time. When we look at somewhere that was encountering storms and is a settlement which is in a very dynamic location, we come to Skara Brae, which is perched here, right here. Of course, it wasn't just right on the coast at the time. It was probably on the edge of a lagoon, which then broke through. But here it is on the coast now. And indeed, it was inundated by sand completely, and then only revealed by a storm in the 19th century, having been hidden for all the centuries and millennia. So that shows you the impact of storms and sand events in terms of covering things up and then revealing them again in this case. So yes, very dynamic environments indeed that people were living within. When we think about monuments such as the Ring of Brodgar and then settlements like Skara Brae, we mustn't make a distinction between domestic and ritual, because at this domestic site, or at this place where people were living, there's evidence that their lives were very, very structured by their beliefs and their understandings of the world. And we find some very interesting deposits, such as two females buried underneath the bed of in House 7, which is the house here, which is the house that is quite special anyway, because it's away from the other houses in terms of not being on the same corridor, has lots of decoration, and has a door that only locks from the outside, not from the inside. So it's a bit of a different house anyway. In addition to this, when this village was abandoned, as it were, Gordon Childe had written about the amount of rubbish that they left lying around, in terms of all the animal bones and beads from a necklace, and you know, just that they abandoned it in great haste and left artifacts, materials scattered all over the floors. It's probable that these were all deposits that related to the leaving of the settlement, and were probably closure materials or artifacts or deposits, in the same way that the two females buried under the bed and burials in other domestic houses were probably foundation deposits. So you have this aspect of putting deposits down to build something, and then when you leave it as well. and that's just a view of one of the houses. And at the Links and Altland, another late Neolithic settlement, this time on Westray, there's evidence of the foundation deposits around the walls of the houses, and with this particular one of the late Neolithic houses, there are cattle skulls in between the inner and the outer skin of the wall that are right the way around the house and are linked. Their horns are linked together right the way around the building, and then there are more cattle bones in the hearths of these houses as well. Moving from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age and Iron Age, at Sumber in Shetland, the buildings were remodelled and modified several times after sandblow events. So people didn't leave where they were living, they didn't abandon the settlement, as in other places such as Toft's Ness. They adapted and maybe shifted their house and then shifted it back again. But in between every one of these events of rebuilding or modifying the house, they spread out a layer of the tools of cultivation that we find around the burial mounds as well. So they're using these particular artefacts as foundation deposits in between each of the remodelling events at these houses. And then at Cladhallen in South Uist, of course, we have houses from the later Bronze Age, which have very well-known deposits of bodies that had been mummified, and in fact, some of them were composite. They're made out of different parts of people, and had obviously been they had been around for some hundreds of years before they'd been buried within the floors of the houses. So people were living with the remains of the dead underneath the houses, and had probably been living with those people within the houses for quite a long time before. And they're thought to have been preserved by keeping them in the peat for a period of time, and then until they were mummified, and then having them in the house or with people. Living with them. And in one of the brochs, indeed in Caithness, there's a body buried in the floor of the broch with his head sticking out up through the floor, and a stone box built round his head. So you could presumably commune with him, take the lid off the box and have the ancestor speaking to you. People in Orkney say that he's faced towards Orkney because that's where he wants to be. He is quite an aged male, that one. So I think some of these traditions were carried on for quite some time. I think you can see some threads running through right from the Neolithic into the Iron Age in terms of treatment of human remains and materials, while other things obviously change quite a lot. And then just to point out another example, this time into the Iron Age, of moving into the Iron Age, of a skeleton of a boy who was cut into four and put into different pits in the floor of a house, along with animal bones as well. And this is kind of one of the most best known examples of this, but is not the only one. So we're seeing these foundation deposits, or the use of human remains in buildings, going right through from the Neolithic into the Iron Age. And these occurrences, although they could relate to better survival, because in these sandy environments we do get better survival of bone, I would suggest also that perhaps we're looking at hyper-rituality, because people are living in such dynamic and mobile environments. So I think that people had strategies for keeping the world in balance, and that's what we're seeing with things like burial rites and the use of human remains in deposits in particular contexts. a lot of their activities were to keep the world in balance and as a strategy for regeneration and future fertility. I think that perhaps when things started to go a bit wrong or out of their control, they perhaps made more and more deposits or changed their practices in terms of if something wasn't being effective, and this is ritual efficacy, if the rituals weren't working, that they would change their strategies and use different kinds of deposits, and you try and use different methods to keep the world in balance. So you have this kind of idea that people felt like they had control over their environment because of their practices and their beliefs and the things that they were doing to procreate gods and to keep the world in balance, but that in some circumstances environmental change or climate change could upset the balance of that. And it's perhaps that causes the changes that we see in material culture, in the way people build their houses and in the way they inhabit the landscape. So it's not so much they're adapting to climate change and to environmental factors that are coming in from outside and being passive respondents, but they, as far as they're concerned, they're trying to keep control of that world by changing the strategies that they're using through their ritual practices. So I think it's fundamental when we're thinking about environmental change in the past that we properly people the environment in the past. And I think that that's been a failing in the way that people have talked about paleo-environment and environmental change. And I think that that's something that's is the case also in the present. In discussions about sustainability, they often take the people or the human element out of the discussion. So I think that it's really, really important that we consider agency in discussion of sustainability, and that we think of adaptation as being proactive. And in this, by this term, I'm using Anthony Giddens' expression that adaptation to climate change and environmental change and remaining sustainable has to be proactive. And it would appear that in the past people were proactive rather than just passive respondents to environmental change. Resilience is another word that's used very often in the context of sustainability in the past. And I think that we do see examples of that in terms of innovation and adaptation, but in this way that I've been describing, in that it's not just technological adaptations and changing agricultural practices, but it's also in the way that they're adapting their religious practices as well. So how do we implement these ideas in terms of how can they be useful to sustainability debates and discussions? How can archaeology have more of a role in discussions about sustainability? Well, I think it is in a better integration of archaeology with other disciplines and with the environmental sciences. And I think it is, rather than providing lessons from the past where we're showing how societies collapsed and how people abandoned and failed at what they were setting out to do, if we see the people in the past as proactive and as agents taking control of their environment, it's more relevant to how society needs to be in the present in terms of taking control of what's happening in environmental change. it's incredibly important that this is part of education in how we're teaching in the universities, and this is something that we're doing in terms of how we're undertaking our field work. We're using coastal eroding sites to heighten consciousness about environmental change, because people are actually working in these environments where they can see sites eroding into the sea. But we're also using them to bring together approaches from archaeology and environmental sciences, and bringing different disciplines together in the field. And undertaking education also using the archaeological sites and the archaeological resource for schools education, and embedding it in learning for sustainability, which we're undertaking a lot of activities around at the moment. And that's all from me, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. We've got about 20 minutes or so for questions. So could I ask, if anyone's asking a question, because we're recording, if you could possibly stand up so that we can see you on camera. Don't let that put you off, please. Does anyone have a question for Jane? To get this going. Can I start? I phoned home tonight and told my 9-year-old son what I was doing tonight, and I said I'm hosting a lecture that's about archaeology, and I asked if he knew what archaeology was, and he didn't do bad. He said it's about digging down and discovering stuff. In the context of your lecture tonight, how would you want to present the role of archaeology? How would you want people to understand archaeology as a discipline in the context of what it can bring to an understanding of our past and how we deal with the present and indeed the future?
Well, of course I'd like it to have relevance, and I think that in looking at archaeology and sustainability and the archaeology of sustainability, that is increasing its relevance. I think that this coming together as with other disciplines as part of the humanities is also the way that we're increasing the relevance of archaeology, but also playing a greater role within the humanities. That's a bit vague, actually.
Sorry, that was a difficult question. Any other questions?
Yes, sorry. You want me to stand up? Jane, I'm interested in what you were saying towards the end about. I'm interested in what you were saying towards the end about people being proactive in trying to achieve environmental homeostasis, and ritual activity would be a way of achieving that. I wonder if there's a distinction between long-term climate change and episodic climate catastrophes, and whether it's possible to separate, to distinguish people's response to that, and the hard question, is there any archaeological evidence of the distinction between the ways that people respond to those very different things? I'm thinking of, say, sand blows, the loss of Culbin on the Murray coast, things that happen that may not be related to climate change.
Well, I think that things that happen over longer periods of time, it's very hard for us to discern how people were responding, or because if we're seeing say in the Bronze Age, we're seeing increased cooler and wetter climate for about 500 years. It's quite hard for us to then say, well, that was responsible for that particular change, or people were doing this because of that, because we can't really understand whether they were perceiving that, those changes, because they're so slow. And that's why I picked on the sand blow, because I thought that it was more straightforward perhaps to see those, and also they might be viewed maybe more as catastrophic events because they were quite sudden and could land at any time really. So I thought if we're focused on those, because we have quite narrow time windows when we can see them, and also we can see them in the stratigraphy on site, so you can see when these episodes are happening. And I was thinking that, by looking at deposition and what was happening within those contexts as well, it was giving us a way into that. And then perhaps we need to look out from that to look at the longer term changes and how we can pinpoint whether there's any relationship between those changes and societal change.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. You mentioned the beads at Scarrow Brae as an example of a closure deposit, as against Gordon Child's idea and the idea of children's novelists, that it was somebody running in haste to escape. Can you think of other sites from the areas that you're familiar with where re-examination of the evidence would be useful to look at it again from your interpretation? And can you give any examples of sites where you think that might be a productive approach?
I think that there's huge scope for looking at many sites and thinking about these kind of contexts and deposition in this way. I think that the site I showed at Links and Noltland is very interesting because it's got such good preservation and it's being dug at the moment, and is showing really curious types of deposition, for instance those cattle skulls. But I do think there are many other places that we could revisit, especially where there's really good stratigraphy and soil micromorphology being done, so we can look at episodes of sand blow and change. I think perhaps it would be worth revisiting some of maybe even Steve Dockrell's work on Sandy, because he's really homed in on that, looking at when people are responding to episodes or catastrophes such as sand blow, but we could then go back and look at how that's in contrast or coinciding with changes in material culture, or what type of deposits are occurring on those sites, such as Toughness.
You think professionally that's quite difficult, because you might be saying to people who are still active, basically, you missed things.
No, I think that we all, well, when something's published, people can revisit and reinterpret. And I work with Steve Dockrell in particular anyway on Rousey, and we're working together in thinking about environmental change and looking at coastal eroding sites. So in that particular respect, I don't think it'd be a problem. But no, I do think there's lots of potential, and I don't think it's a problem because to revisit sites, because as we see, there is huge potential to look at these coincidences or how we can define change. And as we get better data and better resolution, we need to revisit things.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any questions on VC? You're not obliged, don't worry. I'm not okay. Can I ask one, because otherwise I'll kick myself for not asking. I went to Scarborough once when I was very small. You mentioned that room 7 was locked from the outside, not the inside. Any theories as to why that was?
Just that it was a place where obviously people could be locked in. It has been suggested it was to do with separation, perhaps of women at certain times, separation of anybody at a particular time away from other people. So it is quite interesting.
I wondered if it was visitors' quarters, but not trusted visitors. Okay, Jeff.
I've got a question here somewhere. It might be quite hard to dig it out. I'm trying to pick up the message you're given that people in prehistory had strategies in their own worldview for handling changes in their environment. And right now, there are changes in our environment, and people have different responses to those. For instance, planning applications for wind farms, people are either in denial about climate change or changing weather, and they respond in various ways to road infrastructure, which they link to sustainability and climate change. Other people have different responses. People like wind farm developers who are trying to pay to create an educated population, a technically educated population who can understand the debate better about climate change and therefore change their own responses to things like wind farm developments. And in actual fact, Scottish Government are doing the same thing. They are also funding the creation of things like STEM promotion in schools and in local communities, because they think that a better educated population will respond in a different way to issues about sustainability. Does what you've learned in your own links between human responses to catastrophe and climate change, is there something that archaeology can bring to the debate about our own society's response to sustainability?
Well, I think that it's important that the past does have a role to play, and archaeology is the discipline that's bringing that offering, I would say. I think that, I hope I try to stress that rather than in very negative lessons of kind of quite pejorative nature, kind of, people didn't understand their environment in the past, that we're looking at people who were knowledgeable actors and who were taking control of, to the best of their knowledge and the best of their ability, they were taking control of their lives and their environment. And so rather than seeing people in the past as passive and as reactive, they were obviously very proactive. And I think for me that ties in with what Giddens stresses is the need for proactive adaptation now and into the future. And I would say that that's a great linking thread then between the past and the future, and something that archaeology could and should offer to the sustainability debate.
Thank you. Sure.
Somebody that's right at the beginning of archaeological studies, I'm interested in the archetypal archaeologists getting down the hole, digging, dusting. I'm aware that there are quite a few technological advances out there. You mentioned carbon dating, I've seen aerial photographs of this sort of thing. How do you see the future in terms of linking it to those new technologies to aid your investigations?
Well, one example of use of technology which is increasingly popular is laser scanning. And I mention that because we have such a problem of coastal erosion and sites falling into the sea that we have to really devise new ways of recording sites rather than the rather time-consuming ways that we've used in the past, and laser scanning is one technique where we can get a huge amount of really accurate data and information from sites which are too numerous and disappearing too fast for us to be able to record as we would have done in the past, and we're using that in a number of sites in Orkney, and I know other people are using that technology elsewhere. And then combined with that, there's a use of airborne LiDAR, which I think has more potential yet to look at, again, just focusing on the sort of the coastal areas, to look at the shallow water and into the sea as well as onto the land in terms of getting a record and producing data for monitoring, but also a kind of seamless view of the shallow water in the intertidal zone and onto land. So I think there's more potential for using that. Where else? Lots of potential with all the different types of scientific analysis that are being used to great effect. Increasingly DNA, isotope, being used quite commonly now and telling us huge amounts, particularly isotopes, about where people are being brought up and where they're coming from, as opposed to where they're being buried. Better resolution with dating, different types of dating combining together, better use of the dates, so we're getting better chronologies. I'll stop there, but yes, we can speak about that more if you'd like.
Okay. Sorry, one last one. I like the idea of a positive look at sustainability, and if the archaeology of sustainability is about looking at where people have managed to balance society and economy and the environment, could it be said that the 1,000 years of success within early Neolithic Orkney was put paid to because they didn't there was no planning permission for these stone circles?
Well, I think it's interesting that you pick on that particular on the Neolithic, because and this idea of success, because these different periods are characterised by their wealth and success, like the Neolithic, because it's got such great monuments and fantastic achievements in terms of monuments and its architecture. And then we move into the Bronze Age, where it's thought of as rather impoverished and a period of recession. So, but I think that perhaps we're looking at different sort of concepts of success or failure, because in the Neolithic perhaps people were very competitive. There was a very overuse of resources in terms of competitive consumption and perhaps very unstable society, whereas in the Bronze Age, whereas we think they're a bit impoverished and maybe conservative, maybe they were conservative in the sense that they managed to keep a way of life for a really long period of time, because they didn't have that kind of unstable competitive aspect to their way of being. So yeah, it's rather interesting to think about how we conceive of success and failure, and our sort of impressions or our impressionistic ideas of those particular periods.
Okay, thank you. I think that's probably a good point to finish on. James, thank you very, very much indeed. We aim to be a university of, for and in the region that draws on the resources, the natural resources particularly that we have, to learn from them, to use them as a laboratory, and to promote the unique features of our region on a worldwide basis. And I think we can clearly see how Jane is doing that. I said she's a leading figure within UHI, very much part of our developing profile, our maturation, our reputation as a university. And Jane was one of a number of research leads who represented us at a reception at Holyrood Palace last summer. And I think that in itself indicates that she was asked to do that, the leading role that she plays within UHI. So Jane, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. A bit of promotion. The next event in our public lecture series is on the 24th of April. Again, here in Executive Office, 5:15 to 7, booking through the usual channels. And so that's within our culture strand. And the speaker is Jerry Reynolds, who is an event manager, and he'll be talking about some of the preparations for homecoming events. He's responsible for the events programme with Highland Council, so I hope that's of interest to some of you, and hope to see you again on the 24th of April. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.